Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Homage to the blessed one, the holy one, the fully enlightened. Homage to the blessed one, the holy one. Homage to the blessed one, the holy one, the fully enlightened. Hello, everyone. In this week's recording, we're going to be talking about the Four Noble Truths. More specifically, what are the Four Noble Truths? Why are they important? And how that leads up to our next topic, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. So let's start with the, pardon me, the most important question, I guess. Well, it's not really most important, but it's pretty essential. What are the Four Noble Truths? So the Four Noble Truths are basically the Noble Truth of dukkha, dukkha being suffering or unsatisfactoriness. The second Noble Truth being there is an origin to dukkha. The third Noble Truth being that there is the possibility of cessation of dukkha. Then the fourth Noble Truth being the path of practice leading to that cessation of suffering, of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness. So we're going to go through them pretty systematically here, but not in a whole bunch of detail. But I will provide resources in the title and description so that you can get more information if you're interested in something that's a little bit more specific and more detailed than what I describe here. So the first noble truth is the noble truth of dukkha. And there are some interpretations that the first noble truth is that existence is dukkha. And that sort of goes against the grain of the duality that the Buddha was trying to avoid. And this is my personal opinion. My personal opinion, I don't think the Buddha would ever say that existence is suffering or existence is dukkha, because that goes into the existence sort of school of thought, where there is sort of a permanent entity that is experiencing dukkha and then is reborn from lifetime to lifetime. The Buddha was more about with the arising of this comes the arising of dukkha, not that. And even existence itself is in the 12 links of dependent origination, so that arises based upon condition. So I think that existence is suffering thing is really it misses the point. But at the same time, some people still use it, and I, as a traditional Theravada Buddhist in many respects, it sort of rubs me the wrong way that that is still a thing. The first noble truth is the noble truth of dukkha, of suffering and unsatisfactoriness. That it's present, that it's right there, right in front of us, even though we may not be aware of it 100% of the time. That's the first noble truth from my perspective, from my interpretation, from what I've read. Now, the second noble truth is that there's an origin to this dukkha, to this unsatisfactoriness, and that is usually clinging to desire. So there are two sort of elements there that I have to sort of describe. What is clinging? It's a holding on to, a grasping of things. So it can be an object, it can be a feeling, it can be what another phenomena, and thinking that thing is going to provide us some form of happiness that is lasting. That's sort of what my interpretation of the origin of dukkha is. And even grasping to the idea of nirvana can sometimes cause a lot of distress because if you haven't achieved it and you want to achieve it, that can be a real issue. At the same time, it could also be a motivator. So it's sort of, does it bring out the best qualities in you or doesn't it bring the best qualities out in you? And then you got to sort of answer that. Well, sometimes it doesn't bring the best qualities in me because I get frustrated and upset and then I'm cranky and I don't like people. That's more on the unwholesome side. We don't really want that part. We want the side where it's like, yes, I haven't achieved nirvana yet. I haven't achieved that state. I don't have the spiritual progression yet. But if I am patient and I keep going at a steady pace, eventually I'll get there. That's sort of more what we're looking for. We're not looking for, oh, I'm so disgruntled and I want to, bash my head through the wall. That's not what we're looking for when it comes to that. So the second noble truth. In the text, it will say tanha, which means craving. Or if you want the literal word for tanha, which is a Pali word, it's thirst. Think about it. When you're thirsty, you obviously go and get a drink of water, right? Or whatever your choice beverage might be, tea, coffee, whatever it may be. But when we're talking about thirst here, we're talking about deep at a spiritual level. And that thirst cannot be quenched by these sort of mundane sort of objects. Sure, pizza may make me feel better temporarily, but it doesn't fulfill that spiritual sort of side of things. So according to my interpretation, that's sort of what we're talking about. We're talking about a deep spiritual thirst, a thirst for liberation, I guess would be the way I would go about it. And But that being said, the thirst for these worldly things, such as food, people, objects, acquisitions, uh, that sort of thirst can also get in the way of that spiritual progression. As a matter of fact, I bet you there are more than a few monks that might say that those are a huge hindrance towards spiritual progression. That being acquisitions, because then you got to protect those acquisitions. So you're spending more time protecting those acquisitions than you are working on your spiritual progress. And the third noble truth is the noble truth of the cessation of dukkha, which means just basically getting rid of that thirst. And we're not talking about take a drink of water and you're good for a couple hours. We're talking about taking it out at the root and then just completely putting it to the side. You know, if you had a wastebasket, you'd put it in a wastebasket or something because eventually, you got to get rid of the waste or else it's going to stink up the place. Hey, that sort of rhymed. Anyway, so yeah, we have to take that thirst, that craving, and put it to the side completely, and basically just say, okay, hanha, great, don't need it, and then move on. And we're not talking about like I said, you take a drink of water and then you're done. This is at a deep spiritual level, and it can take quite some time. It takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of practice in order to get that direction. But the third noble truth just says, there is the cessation. And then finally, you have the fourth noble truth, which is the path of practicing the cessation of dukkha, which is the noble eightfold path. And I wrote these down because sometimes I get them out of order or I forget them altogether. So we have uh, right view, right intention, right speech. After that, right action. Thank you. I wrote it down. Right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And I feel like I would be cheapening the experience if I actually went through these right now, because this is a whole recording in itself. So the fourth noble truth just basically states that there is a path of practice leading to cessation of dukkha. And some interpretations have made the Buddha as like the ultimate spiritual doctor, where we have the spiritual ailing of dukkha, of suffering, unsatisfactoriness, and the sort of uh, the four noble truths sort of formula, I guess I would call it, is what is the issue? So the issue here is the noble truth of dukkha. What is the cause? So we're looking at what is the origin of dukkha. So that's the second noble truth. And then we go with the diagnosis, which would sort of be the third noble truth. Noble truth of the cessation of said disease, which is um, dukkha. And then we have the medicine, the fourth noble truth, the noble truth of the path of practice leading to cessation of dukkha, that being the noble eightfold path. And so some people compare the Buddha to being like the ultimate spiritual doctor, physician. So that's sort of one perspective that I find helpful. And I use the Four Noble Truth method when it comes to my own issues. So what's the issue? What is the origin of the issue? Is there basically a cessation of this issue? Is there a solution? And then what is the path of practice leading to that solution? So I use that regularly. So, why are the Four Noble Truths so important? Well, the first thing I would say is you remember the Noble Eightfold Path. I listed off right view as the first one, right? And right view is the Four Noble Truths. Right view is the three marks of existence of impermanence, dukkha, and not self. And so, the importance of the Four Noble Truths is it gets us started on that path. And ultimately, the Four Noble Truths basically are the path. The Noble Eightfold Path sort of gets its own recordings, its own talks, but at the same time, the Noble Eightfold Path is contained within the Four Noble Truths. So without the Four Noble Truths, we don't have the Noble Eightfold Path, which leads to another point. The Four Noble Truths are the Four Noble Truths. It doesn't stop at the Noble Truth of dukkha. If that were the situation, uh, probably Buddhism would be considered a very pessimistic belief system or religion. But no, there are the other noble truths: the noble truth of the origin of dukkha, the noble truth of cessation of dukkha, and noble truth of the path of practice leading to cessation dukkha. So instead of being a pessimistic, there's not much we can really do about dukkha thing, uh, the Buddhist principle, the Four Noble Truths, says that yes, there is that issue of dukkha. However, there are things that we can do in order to at least reduce that amount of dukkha. And here's another point, and I'm going to put this as a resource in the description. Ajahn Sumedho, who's a very revered Theravada teacher, has a text, a very short text, well, short relative to other Buddhist texts and books. I think it's 70 pages or something like that about the Four Noble Truths. And he makes this point very clearly, and this is more from a monk's perspective than a layperson's perspective, but it's worth mentioning. He says, well, look, the Four Noble Truths doesn't say uh, the noble truth of the origin of my dukkha. And I think that is to prevent us from getting into this misconception that there is a permanent sort of entity that is experiencing dukkha. And so in his work, he's careful to say, look, it's not my dukkha, it's not your dukkha, it's not our dukkha, it's just dukkha. There's no owner really. It's sort of like if I dive into the ocean and there's a whole bunch of water around me. I don't own the water, it's not my water. It's not really our water because not everyone owns the ocean. As a matter of fact, I would say no one owns the ocean. I mean, there are some arguments that maybe nations own rights to the ocean, or have an ocean boundary, or rivers sometimes are used as boundaries, but it's not necessarily our ocean. It's just the ocean. So the Atlantic Ocean is the Atlantic Ocean, and so if I take a dive into the Atlantic Ocean, it's not my Atlantic Ocean. It's not my water. It's not our water. It's not their water. It's just the Atlantic Ocean. It's just water. So that's the same thing with dukkha. We experience dukkha in our lives frequently, but it's not really ours per se. It's just dukkha. And if you think about it, now think about this from a logical point of view, not an emotional one necessarily. Okay, so if dukkha is not owned by anyone, why would we cling to it? Why would we hold on to our dukkha? And there I go. I just said it's not our dukkha. But then I said it. Durr. I should probably work on my language here. But here's the thing: if no one owns that dukkha, why would any particular being hold on to dukkha? And that's the amazing thing about some differences between, say, a human being and a deer. So a deer cannot make this realization, or if it does, if a deer does make this realization, it's very, very difficult because a deer is stuck in survival mode most of the time. Now, we as human beings, we have leisure time. We have time that we can put aside for other pursuits rather than survival. That's how advanced we've sort of become. It doesn't mean that we're not part of the animal kingdom. It just means that for the most part, we're not really struggling for survival 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's not necessarily the case. There may be some human beings where survival is really difficult, and so they'll have less time for other pursuits such as spirituality and other hobbies. But we're going to say that for the most part, we do have that time that we can put aside. And so, not to pursue sort of the spiritual side of things from a Buddhist standpoint and trying to progress is a little bit, what should we say? A little bit unwise because even small steps in this life can go leaps and bounds for the next life. Although that's a very complicated topic in itself. So the topic for the next recording is going to be the Noble Eightfold Path. So we're going to look at what is right view, what is right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. What are those things? And how integral are those toward a Buddhist practice? So, summary version, the Four Noble Truths are the noble truth of dukkha, the noble truth of the origin of dukkha, the noble truth of the cessation of dukkha, and the noble truth, the path of practice leading to cessation of dukkha, that being the Noble Eightfold Path, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Why are they important? Because without the Four Noble Truths, you don't have the Noble Eightfold Path, and therefore, without that, there's no spiritual path toward the cessation of dukkha. And then we're sort of stuck with, well, there's dukkha. What are we supposed to do about that? All right, so until the next recording, everyone, take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you soon. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.